with this screen out here right now just to welcome everybody and to say thank you to Miguel for coming. I'm going to stop sharing and figure out how to get this going right here. And today we're really lucky to have Mr. Gomez come and present to us. He's one of the guys I've been interacting with in the field for the last several years, and he's almost done with his PhD, although I think he probably could have been done like a few years ago.
Probably.
But he's doing a lot of really great research. One of the reasons I like his research, and you'll see from the paper that's in front of some of the folks in the room here. And if you want a copy of his paper, I can send it to you during or after the chat today. Is that he focuses a lot on decision making in cybersecurity, which is near and dear to my own heart. And he has done a lot of different really fascinating both theoretical and quantitative analyses on decision making in cyberspace. He's worked a lot with Chris White, who just joined the call as well. So hopefully Chris can throw out some really tough, nasty questions to try and stress him out a little bit. But we really appreciate you coming today. And the way this format works, for those of you who have never participated before, is that for the first 30 minutes, Miguel and I are going to chat. And we're going to ask some questions about this paper that he's recently had published. And he's going to try and provide some feedback on this paper and some clarification on some of the various different issues associated with it. And then he's going to answer some questions that I ask all people who come, regardless of what their research agenda is. And then we're going to open it up to people in the Zoom room, as well as you all in here. And we're going to hopefully give him some tough questions to make him think, but in a nice and constructive way. So Miguel, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah. So just to introduce myself, so as Aaron already briefly mentioned, I'm a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies. I'm also a doctoral candidate at the University of Hildesheim over in Germany. And my main area of research, my main research interest is in decision-making in the context of cybersecurity, both at the level of your political elites and more recently involving the general public at large. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank Aaron for inviting me over for this talk. And the paper that we actually have that we'll be discussing today focuses on my dissertation. This is actually the theory paper for my PhD work, and it actually, just to get the ball rolling, it actually asks the deceptively simple question of where do strategic preferences when it comes to cybersecurity come from? Phrased more plainly, why do states behave the way they do in cyberspace? And I think this is interesting for two main reasons. The most obvious reason why it's particularly relevant to us is that any attempts to actually try to manage behavior in this environment, in this human-made environment, will ultimately boil down to the question of why do certain actions, or why are certain preferences made by certain state actors? So that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin here is that I would say that this is a natural extension of where cybersecurity research over the last 10 years has been moving towards. So if you're familiar with the literature, the last 10 years seen a lot of scholars look at whether or not cyber operations are actually useful instruments in order to achieve specific strategic objectives. So this whole idea that whether or not cyber is indeed revolutionary has been the core focus of the literature over the last, I'd say 10, maybe 15 years. And it's come to the point wherein I think there is a general, so those of you who want to like chime in on this later on, feel free to do so, but I think there's a general consensus now that when you talk about cyber operations, we've pretty much dismissed the idea that independent use of these instruments really don't work. You'd have to use them in conjunction with other tools of foreign policy, whether this be military or non-military in nature. What's sort of been left unanswered here is the question of why specific preferences are chosen. So we've already answered the question whether or not they work. The follow-up question is that why do states keep on choosing or behaving in a particular manner when it seems that they might not always be optimum for them to proceed in this particular fashion. And that's where the paper in my research finds itself in. And the approach I take to answering this question is we first have to understand what uncertainty is in the broader context of cyberspace. So when I look through the literature that we currently have, it seems that most of a general understanding that cyber operations are used as a means to overcome uncertainty in this space, but very little is actually said as to what constitutes or what defines uncertainty in this environment. Aaron's own research takes a stab at that one. Other scholars have also attempted to broadly define or to unpack this notion of uncertainty as it applies to cybersecurity and cyberspace. And the area that I try to position my research here is that when you talk about uncertainty in cyberspace, we have to be clear whether we're talking about uncertainty as a function of the lack of information or as an information deficit or as a function of ambiguity. So when we say that it's a function of an information deficit, we mean that whatever operations or whatever actions or preferences states make in terms of their behavior in cyberspace is done so as a means to gain more information. So one way that you could think about this is how Posen in this book argues that militaries prefer offensive operations because it allows them to control the battle space. It allows them to be in a position wherein they are directing the action of their adversaries so that they have the information advantage. And when you start to unpack the literature, that's not really what I see in the context of cybersecurity. Developments in technology have allowed us, forensic technology in particular, has allowed us already overcome a lot of like the hurdles when it comes to the lack of information in this domain. Our ability to attribute is better, our ability to detect threats are better, but we're still at the point wherein there's still a significant amount of ambiguity that's present in this space. So when I say ambiguity, this is, for instance, when you find malware on a system, you're not really sure what that means, other than the fact that malware is on your system. But we know for a fact that the presence of malware can either indicate an attempt at espionage or maybe to lay the foundation for a more disruptive attack down the line. So the simple act of finding malicious code does not really tell us what the intent of the adversary is. And I argue in this paper that along with other examples do not really communicate well do not really communicate certainty within this environment. Now, when you talk about uncertainty from the point of view of ambiguity, there are several ways around that. Norms have been raised as a way of overcoming that, but the issue of norms in cyberspace is still kind of contentious at this point. The other way that it can be overcome, if we go back to cognitive and political psychology, is this whole notion of cognitive shortcuts. So you have your heuristics and other constructs, and the construct that I settle here on are schemas, which, if you want to think, a quick and easy way to think about schemas is it's kind of like a checklist, a mental checklist in your brain that if you want to achieve task A, this is what you do. The question here is that while schemas are relatively uncontroversial when it comes to discussing where preferences may come from, the bigger question here is that how do these schemas form? Or what constitutes these schemas? And this is where I make this link between schemas and strategic culture in this paper. Strategic culture itself is a separate and equally contentious issue. But if we go into more recent strategic culture scholarship the last 15 years, 15, 20 years of strategic culture scholarship, how they treat strategic culture basically as a guide towards established and ingrained guides towards achieving specific objectives is in line with this definition of cognitive schema. So I go on in the paper to argue that strategic culture functions as cognitive schemas that essentially shape how decision makers think and preferences that form in the context of an ambiguous environment. And
Miguel,
throughout
let
this
me pull
paper,
on that thread.
sorry.
Let me pull
Yeah,
on that
continue.
thread a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. So you outlined that three primary, I'm going to go into the second question. So the three, because you've really got a good overview there. In the second question I had for you was these schemas that you've been discussing, right? You identify that the three primary cyber powers in global conflict essentially have three fundamentally different schemas in which they frame risk and uncertainty and other types of things in cyberspace. Could you dive a little bit into those concepts, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, sure. So I won't claim credit for this one. The one who actually pointed this out, it's in the book by Brandon Variano, Ben Jensen, and Ryan Mans. In their book, they argue that there are distinct ways of cyber conflict, and they go on to explain that the US has a way of doing it, Russia has a way of doing it, China has a way of doing it. And what that simply means is that, and I'm going beyond what I've mentioned in the paper here, carrying over to other succeeding papers that I've done and I'm working on. What this refers to are particular normative beliefs as to how or what actions are appropriate in pursuit of certain goals. So in the paper, for instance, I argue that in the context of China, for instance, although they would technically have the capability of engaging in more offensive actions in this space, they tend to limit themselves more to espionage type of operations. And we can trace this back. In the book that I mentioned earlier, does a great job at this, trace this back to preferences that predate cyber, this whole notion of gaining information dominance over an adversary, as molding what would be appropriate courses of action for them. In the case of the US, for instance, in the paper I mentioned this technology engineering focus on strategic choices that lead to very controlled and specific operations. And we see this, for instance, when scholars unpack the whole Stuxnet operation, for instance, how directed and precise it had to be. And again, this traces back to normative expectations within specific community members within the national security community in the US, that they feel that they have to abide by. So when I say normative expectation, I'm not talking about moral expectations here, but essentially what has been derived from their historical experience, what has worked for them in the past, and can now be applied in an environment that we assume is not completely understood because of its dynamic nature. But since it has worked previously, they would apply it in this context. In the paper, I argue that this is not always going to be the case. So there are situations wherein these schemas might not always be deployed. So for instance, if, let's say, decision makers are motivated to be accurate, then they engage in a more objective assessment of the environment to see what options are more appropriate. So it's not an absolute situation wherein I already have the schema or I have this model of strategic culture that I'm patterning my behaviors on, and I will go on with this. I'm very careful not to push on that one because that's pretty much the main criticism that's been leveled against the whole concept of strategic culture, that if you can't use anything else to explain behavior, throw strategic culture at it, and it pretty much explains. So I am very clear in terms of what the scope conditions are when it comes to explaining behavior in this environment.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to sidestep a little bit the next question, but I'm going to ask a second question here that I didn't write down for you. It was, you talk a little bit about subcultures influencing, and then you talk a little bit about organizations and how organizations adapt and change their strategic cultures over time, or their schemas, and how they frame ideas, and how organizations that don't necessarily do this don't always continue to succeed, or they fail over the long term. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So this whole notion of subcultures speaks to, or at least hints directly at the fact that within states, even the most authoritarian of states, you'd still have a small number of individuals who may belong to different organizations or may hold different beliefs about how the world works. And this has to be acknowledged when it comes to decision making in the whether in the context of cyber operations or more conventional security concerns, wherein you'd have different groups competing with one another to push or establish or promote their view of the world. And what happens here, and I argue this in the paper, is that essentially the dominant subculture, or the dominant subculture which inadvertently influences your main strategic culture, would be those that eventually have to, those that would prove to be successful over the long run. What's interesting to note here, and I actually did not point this out in the first paper too much, but this develops over the course of my research, is that we have to be very careful when we discuss the whole notion of subcultures. Not all subculture, you might have multiple subcultures within a single state, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely distinct from one another. So if we basically operationalize schemas, strategic culture as schemas, we then have to acknowledge that schemas are hierarchical. So you could have higher level schemas that reflect beliefs that are common throughout the decision-making community based on shared experiences, shared history, shared expectations. But then you may have distinct variations at the level of the organization, simply because these organizations have their own preferences, have their own objectives. So the example that I use here in another paper is that preventing escalation is a goal that might be common across the board across different decision makers, but they may vary in terms of how they believe that is best achieved. So we have to acknowledge that this whole notion of subcultures does not necessarily indicate that each subculture is completely incompatible with the other one.
Fantastic. Yeah. So this is really great, and I love this. And so one of the questions that oftentimes gets raised is, okay, we've done a lot of theory work, right? And I know that Chris is on the call too, so maybe he can join in the conversation as well here. But how can we operationalize these types of things to better understand? So to take the theoretical propositions, you have propositions in here that you've stated that are based on a lot of case analysis and other types of things. And how can we quantify those, or how can we measure those in real terms?
All right. So this was actually funny that you raised this question. This was exactly a question I got from a reviewer as well. So how do you measure, or how do you paper that Chris and I are working on? How do you measure strategic culture, even if you operationalize it as a schema? It's one of the harder questions to answer. In another paper that we hope to be coming out, what we basically did there was we in a war game that we ran, cross-national war game that we ran, involving the Philippines, Taiwan, the US, Switzerland, and Singapore. We argue there that if strategic culture is a thing, if we expose them to similar situations, we should have variation across cultural national lines. And what we did there was, we basically, during the debriefing and during non-participatory observation, we tried to identify what their overall strategic objectives were. In the paper that we're discussing today, I mentioned a typology developed by Kitchen, where you have scientific ideas, intentional ideas, and operational ideas. So we argue there that your scientific ideas basically link up to your scientific and intentional ideas, link up to your strategic objectives. And basically what we're doing here is that if strategic objectives vary despite having similar situations in front of them, and holding that constant and only varying nationality and cultural background, then we are in a position to argue that there is some cultural influence going on there. So in the context of trying to unpack or take a culturalist slash psychological approach to measuring strategic culture, we find that simulations in war games are the best way to do it. From my end, I tried to do this experimentally, priming them to adopt a particular mindset. That did not work perfectly. So this whole approach, while interesting, does carry with it significant methodological baggage. So in that paper, we're very careful to keep any causal claims that we make to a minimum, simply because that the only way that we can actually demonstrate this is if we continue to repeat these war games, and we're actually still in the process of doing that. So we're still revising the war game. We plan to be running that in the near future. And then, of course, the other approach that to do to test these things is to go and do in-depth case studies. So in my case, that's the third paper in my that's part of my dissertation package. So I take essentially a deep dive into how the Philippines, so where I come from, conceptualize cybersecurity as a national security issue. And I find that the Philippines is an interesting case here because it fits in so nicely with a lot of the claims as to why cybersecurity becomes common of national security. This whole issue of you use it for signaling, you use it to augment or to communicate with an adversary. And the idea here with this particular case study is to see whether or not the justifications for how cybersecurity is incorporated within the whole national security framework is aligned with materialist explanations or system and technology level explanations, as opposed to whether it's better explained by the underlying strategic culture of the Philippines and the region at large. So in that approach, I look at both domestic and like regional strategic culture. So it's a matter of collecting the necessary, the relevant documents, interviews, public statements, and whatnot.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it. I've read the initial wargaming paper in Diggy. So, my next question is something that you're well positioned to answer, since even though you don't have your PhD yet, you've been a central figure in this field for a number of years now. What do you think are the gaps that need to be studied in cyber conflict studies in general right now? If you had to identify 3 gaps.
3 gaps. So the biggest gap here, obviously, I will, because this is what I'm working on for my PhD, is the first one I'd point out is this whole question of the source of the strategic preferences. This is the first one I'd raise. The whole notion of strategic culture as an explanation is only one possible angle to look at it. There are several ways to look at it. There's this whole norms angle as well, which you could use to explain it. So this whole where do strategic preferences come from is one of the more significant gaps that we need to address. Another gap that is worth looking into, and a couple of us have been pursuing it, is how do publics react? Again, harkening back to this whole decision-making concept, a lot of effort has been spent on figuring out how political elites would respond following a security incident, but only a handful scholars have started working on how do the general public respond to this. And if you're interested in that, a good place to start with is work coming out of the University of Haifa. So work by Ryan Chandler, Daphne Canetti. Their group does spectacular work on this one. I'd also raise some of the work that Chris and I have done in this regard as well. A third point, and this speaks to another project that I'm also working on right now, is the question of alliances. And how does that link with the notion of cybersecurity? So the last few months, especially with that meeting between Biden and Putin, I think we are now in a point wherein we have to start to consider that cybersecurity will move alongside this shift towards great power politics. So the idea the last few years was that we use cyberspace and cyber operations as a means to maintain this status quo between multiple states, but with this upsurge in interest among established powers, it's interesting to see how the alliance dynamics, if at all, will actually start to factor in this conversation.
That's my final question for you before we open it up to more broad questions from everybody else is, what books or articles do you recommend for folks just starting out in the field? If you had to say maybe 5, let's limit it to 5 or so.
Okay. So for books, I'd say the one I have on the list here, so Wars of Disruption and Resilience by Chris Demchak gives a good early overview of how things progress, so how cyber falls in, how cyber conflict, power, and national security intersect. We also have Cyber Strategy, the evolving character of power and coercion, by Brandon Valeriano, Ben Jensen, and Ryan Manis. That's interesting, especially if you're interested in distinct ways that states employ cyber operations. They do a good job in trying to piece that out, I find, and it's actually I'd say one of the trigger points that pushed me in this direction for my research. You have Ben Buchanan's cybersecurity dilemma, so how ambiguity factors into cybersecurity. In terms of broader decision making, I have to recommend your book, The Decision to Attack, Military and Intelligence Cyber Decision Making, and then the work also by Chris and Brian, Understanding Cyber Warfare, Politics, Policy, and Strategy, is a good introductory text as well to the whole cybersecurity issue. Yeah, I'd say that those are like the 5 books I'd recommend. As for articles, it really depends on where you're interested in going. I'd say that Erica Borghardt and Sean Lonergan's work on the logics of cyber coercion is always a nice read. I still use Adam Liff's article, whose title eludes me now, when he discusses how cyber conflict plays out across different actors. I still use that despite its age. It's also a host of other, there's a lot of very, very interesting literature that's coming out, that's come out in the last 5-10 years, that speaks to a wide variety of research angles in cybersecurity and cyber conflict.
Okay, great. I'm going to open it up to questions now from everybody who's participating. Do any of you all have a question you feel like asking so far in the room? Yeah.
So,
Cameron, speak loudly, Cameron.
okay, so one of the questions that I had was earlier when you were discussing the different gaps that you filled and that you felt were in the field, you mentioned like, I guess, cyber response to like different things that were happening, like espionage or different attacks. whatnot. And I guess the question I have is, do you feel like that is due to like a lack of experience, i.e. for like wargaming, or is that just, do you feel, I guess why for this?
So if I heard that correctly, is why do certain states not respond to cybersecurity incidents? Did I hear
I think
that?
it's more like how they respond to different types of incidents very differently, but is it because of a lack of experience, tactical experience, or is it a lack of practice experience in terms of wargaming or other types of things? It seems, I think there's no consistency in response. Is that right? There's no consistency in response. Cameron is asking.
Okay, so I'd say that at this point there's no one answer to that one. So the easiest way to segregate this would be if you look at the established actors in cyberspace versus the non-established ones. When I say established, you can think of the US, China, Russia. In that case, I would attribute this whole idea of non-response probably more because of certain strategic considerations within the environment. But when we look to more emergent actors in this space, then the waters become a bit more muddied here. In some areas, it could be because of lack of capabilities, which is probably the most straightforward way of answering it. They don't respond because they don't have the capability to respond, or they could also choose not to respond because it's not worth responding to. One thing to note is that despite all the early rhetoric about cyber doom and all, we really have not experienced cybersecurity incident that has proven to be an existential issue to states. Most of it is basically disruptive and constitute nothing more than a nuisance. In that case, it could be they choose not to respond because it's simply not worth responding to. So it's actually in this area where the research that I'm doing for my dissertation finds itself in. Over the last few years, I've focused the arguments more towards emergent state actors, wherein I use established preferences in the operationalized as schemas to try to frame how they respond to these incidents. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. And we have 4 questions in the chat, 5 now, I think. And so I'm going to ask the first 2, because they're sent to me as a private message. They're from a graduate student at Virginia Tech. And the first of the 2 questions was, I'd be curious to know where the speaker sees his research interest taking him post PhD and dissertation.
Okay. So I'm pretty much staying in the academia at this point. But I've been in Europe for, at this point, I think close to 7 years now. So I'm shifting my gaze closer to the Asia Pacific. I mean, professionally, there's really not a lot of people working on cyber security in that area. So I'm kind of moving myself in that direction. It's a fairly interesting environment to be in because if you think about it, if you read through a lot of the literature in cyber that we look at are very Western NATO oriented. So a lot of the lessons that we learn are from the experiences of states that are from those regions or that belong to that bloc. There's very little to be said about there's not much to be said about what we know from cyber from the experience of actors that are not part of this group. So that's one motivating reason why I'm shifting to that particular geographic location.
Well, we're hoping you're going to come I think Chris and I are hoping you'll come to Virginia, but
oh, definitely.
The second question from that same graduate student was, what areas of cybersecurity do you think are receiving the least attention despite their significance to global security?
Personally, I think it's how. So I think it would be from the point of view of decision making. And I don't say this because I'm trying to promote my own work, but really because a lot of the work that we've done, as I mentioned earlier, has been focused on trying to understand whether or not operations work, not really on why decision makers behave in a particular manner. And I don't think this is because they're not at all interested in that angle. It's more of the challenges associated with that type of research. So any type of decision-making research will automatically run into questions of who do you run or collect information from. Cyber is still fairly new, so pretty much the archival work is out of the question this early on, so that you're left with either interviews, simulations, or experiments. Now, if we're talking about elites, the whole experiment question is not going to be feasible simply because there's not a lot of people that you can probably include in an experiment to make it as robust as you would want it to be. You're more likely to find some success when it comes to interviews and simulations, but I mean the challenges can be daunting if you're just getting into this field, just starting out your PhD. The logistics for that can be particularly daunting. So, case in point, the war game that Chris and I ran, I'd say, for instance, in the case of a number of Southeast Asian participants, that took almost a year beforehand to arrange doing that, and then there's all having to fly over there to deploy it. So I think decision making is important. I know I feel that a lot of people want to go into it or to focus on that issue, but are discouraged to an extent by the methodological and logistical expectations of doing work in that area.
Okay, great. Let me, Ayahan, would you like to ask your question out loud? Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, why not? Hello, Miguel. Hello, all.
Yeah.
My question is related to uncertainty concept, because we know that uncertainty is a very central concept for many disciplines like economics, psychology, and IR. So we can say that this is not a new concept for foreign policy decision makers, although they are facing with it in a very regular way. For instance, when dealing with the pandemic or climate change, uncertainty is also present. We think that what makes different uncertainty in cyberspace when we look to other disciplines? Thank you.
I'd say that the whole question of uncertainty in cyberspace, this is funny because Chris and I were literally just discussing this 2 hours ago, is the nature of the environment. And I think it's three ways. So the nature of the environment, its inherent features, because it's particularly unpredictable. We don't know how things will break and where they will break. The dynamism that's associated with the environment in context of its reach. And you'd also have to include beliefs that are established in people's thinking because of narratives that they hear. In this case, I'm referring to this whole cyber doom narrative. So as opposed to, let's say, pandemics, wherein you have a pathogen which you could physically study, there's this intangibility to the environment, cyberspace, that increases this sense of ambiguity. And then you add to that its features, its latent unpredictability, for instance, that makes uncertainty very problematic in this environment wherein you would probably find a lot of these cognitive mechanisms that we evolved with being used to overcome the uncertainty in this environment, for better or for worse.
Great, thank you. And Gabriel, you had a question? Would you be interested in saying it out loud?
Yes, thank you. I'm a student from Virginia Tech in the master's program. So, and I'm also coming from the kind of international relations side of things. And so I was curious because a lot of what you were discussing in your initial speech was about the US, Russia, and China, so state actors. And so I was wondering if in your paper you addressed the role of potential independent people who engage in cyber attacks or hacking, or if that's outside of the scope of your research?
So lone wolves, or let's label them patriotic hackers, if they're acting on behalf of the state, but without their official support. It's not in scope of my research, but most certainly schemas and their beliefs about how the state should act could fall into their decision to engage in particular types of operations. So if there's this latent belief that you should not allow your interest to be trampled upon, so the idea of the state asserting itself, most certainly that actors capable who are outside the state, if they have the capability to respond to this, they would certainly do so. We see this in cases, for instance, of the Philippines, for instance, wherein every time the whole South China Sea issue flares up, it's almost completely expected that you'll have a barrage of Filipino hackers launching disruptive operations, mostly defacement attacks against Chinese websites. And if you were to press me on this one, I could link this. I could possibly find the link here if I were to interview one of these individuals. I think I could find the link between their decision to do this and some common normative expectations about how we should respond to these provocations.
Dr. White notes that in addition to those research works, we shouldn't forget that there are wonderful cyber conflict coursebook primers, including the ones published by him and the one that the students in this room have all had in their courses as well.
Yes.
Thanks
for pointing that out, Chris.
Yeah. So those are good introductory things. So I'm going to ask this question, unless you want to ask it out loud, I'll ask it for you, because I think that every other time I've asked your questions. Do you want to ask yours out loud, or would you prefer me to do it?
Hello, Dr. Brantley. No, I can ask it this time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
Very
great.
generous last time. This time I have a better computer.
Okay.
So, Miguel, pleasure having you, and I want to thank Professor Brantley for setting this up. My name is Moon Sofab. I'm a PhD student at the Virginia Tech School of Government and in International Affairs, and a student of Professor Brantley as well. And I followed your work extensively over the last few years, and this is a pleasure to have you here. Having said that, you've mentioned the normative behaviors, which I've been looking at extensively in regards to the government group of experts and the open-ended working group. One, an approach that was promoted by the United States and the NATO allies, and the other one, I believe it was by Russia. Two distinctive and sort of contentious different approaches to how to stabilize cybersecurity. Having said that, they have met with some minimal success, given that how the nature of cybersecurity is viewed as a statecraft tool by primarily Russia, the United States, and China. Do you think the time has come for somewhat a body of an international cybersecurity governance that is binding, like we have with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? Thank you.
Interesting question, and quite difficult question to answer. I think we've come at a point wherein such an agreement might find support amongst countries with a shared view of cyberspace, or what constitutes cyberspace and what constitutes appropriate behavior in this domain. I wouldn't compare it directly to nuclear weapons, for instance, simply because the urgency and the effects of nuclear weapons proliferating, being used improperly, is very clear to all the parties involved. So it's very tangible, and it makes justifying norms or pushing for these norms for support globally a lot easier as compared to cyber, for instance. And an example that I'd use here, and I've spoken about this in a paper I did a couple of years ago in the context of cyber norms in ASEAN, is this whole notion of trying to adapt cyber norms still first has to address this looming question of what is cybersecurity, what is cyberspace, and how do we all differ from that view. And a good example I'll point out here is that if you look at a lot of or at least what is available within Southeast Asia, for instance, cyber strategies or white papers produced by their national security bodies, there's this inherent link between cybersecurity and internal stability, which in theory introduces some gray areas in terms of disagreements as to how or what is allowed or what is permissible between those actors who view their security concerns as such versus other actors, such as, let's say, the US and the UK. So I would say that the first step right now would try to build rapport or consensus within like-minded groups, and then try to engage other silos, which is a term I use in that paper, to try to bridge gaps in terms of how they view cyberspace. The ASEAN approach to the solution would be through confidence building measures, for instance, to try to get how the other party, try to understand how the other party thinks about cyber before we push norms towards their direction. So it's this whole notion of trying to socialize different subgroups who may not agree on all points of what norms we have at the moment, I think should be the first step in this direction.
Dr. White, I'm gonna let you ask your question.
Hey there. Essentially, my question was just for any international cooperation regime pertaining to malicious behavior in cyberspace, how would a verification process work? Verification of a complex, infrastructurally intensive process like the development of nuclear weapons is one thing. It's something where there's there's an on-the-ground substantial commitment of resources that can be effectively tracked by a sophisticated organizational process. The development of new technologies, of new techniques, their proliferation pertaining to cyber conflict is the exact opposite of that, right? It's a situation where you have so much development occurring in the private sector, much development occurring in areas of, particularly under authoritarian regimes, areas of the marketplace that are essentially devolved and divorced from the formal security forces of a country, but not actually in real terms that distant from them, right? There are direct ties to intelligence entities linked to the Chinese, the Russian government, the Uzbek government, what have you, as well as a substantial amount of malware development and an infrastructure setup. I think that's a particularly important point as well, pertaining to organized cyber operations occurring in the world of organized crime, again, as it pertains to the geopolitical interests of countries like Russia. So you have an immense murky area here where the question of verification from looking at it as a parallel from the nuclear example, it just doesn't seem like there's too much of a precedent there to actually help us out. So how would we actually develop a regime that allowed us in a reasonably sophisticated fashion to verify the compliance of the signatories?
Miguel, please solve this problem.
Sorry.
Problem and then accept the Nobel Prize.
Oh, damn. This is actually where I really wish that Leonard, one of my colleagues, was here to answer. Leonard and Florian, I think they'd be in a better position than me to answer this one. So this is exactly why I try to avoid linking cyber to this whole notion of, or how we traditionally viewed nuclear security, because it's a completely different approach. My sort of vague sense here as to how verification and compliance will work, this will be inherently tied to our ability to cooperate or to somehow take into the fold private sector actors, especially threat intel actors, when it comes to essentially publishing or disclosing information that is available to them in terms of what they see coming out of X country or non-state actors with known affiliations with particular state actors. I know that's not the answer that we want here, but I think that closer ties with these groups are necessary. But of course, there is a lot of conceptual hurdles that you'd have to address here that still need to be solved. But definitely, what I can answer I can answer here, and what Chris has pointed out quite clearly, is that we really have to move away from the nuclear security verification model here. It simply does not work in the context of cyber.
Okay, we have one question from the room here. So you want to ask your question?
Okay.
Can I?
It's
Oh, sorry.
not a very formal question, but going off of your kind of qualitative analysis of merging this gap of an information deficit with your cognitive and like strategic thinking as well as schemas, I was wondering if you had any quantitative analysis that kind of goes into backing up your, I guess, sense of overcoming this uncertainty in the cyberspace, because a lot of this is very behavioral. And coming from my background of kind of data analysis, I was wondering what kind of quantitative measures you use to kind of pull together your work.
So to clarify your question, what you wanted to know is that if I have quantitative data to show how much of information they want to consume, is that your?
Yeah, just in
sorry.
general, what kind of quantitative information you have utilized to kind of back your work?
So I guess,
Okay.
yeah, what quantitative data do you have for your work, but also how could we measure quantitatively uncertainty associated with the domain?
Okay. So with this work, this project in particular, I take a very qualitative approach to this. Simply because my focus is on schemas and strategic culture, and what I found is that any attempts to apply quantitative techniques to that one, I know some people have, but in the way that I'm approaching it, a quantitative approach is not suitable for this question in particular. But for other research, projects, for instance, I have this one paper where I try to measure how much is prior beliefs regarding country X's behavior tend to influence country Y, or the publics from country Y, how they perceive that. So in that case, we ask them to explain their choices, or I ask them to explain their choices after they go through the scenario, and then basically count the number of particular themes in reference to key attributes of state X's behavior in their response. And I basically regress that against the treatment variable, which is its reputation. So essentially, I see whether or not dictating a particular or establishing a particular reputation a priori is used as a means of overcoming the ambiguity of the situation. Because in the scenario that I present them, I don't give them any background or explicit background as to who was behind this. But then one of the treatments in that experiment, I then mentioned, but X country behaved this way in the past. And then I see, I code, essentially count how many references in their explanation they pointed or they alluded to country X's previous reputation, to see how they use these things to overcome ambiguity.
And I'd say that Jackie Schneider and some of her work has also used non-elite sentiment to understand uncertainty of actors in response to their different things. Chris, do you want to continue? Sorry.
No, that's no problem at all. I just couldn't find because I'm not used to doing this, I couldn't find the raise hand button quick enough. It was a two-finger response actually to the previous question, I suppose, comment I made about international cooperation, because I don't like appearing to be the doomsayer in the room. I think I would push back hard against anybody that thinks a grand bargain or a grand cooperative regime on cyber conflict behavior is likely or possible in international relations. But I do think that an incremental kind of chipping away at the problem is not only possible, but I think is immensely viable. And I think it does come down to finding the metaphors and the parallels that actually do start to make a little bit more sense than the nuclear one most people look to. There are ways of looking at, elements of the digital security or insecurity threats we face that they look a little bit more like what we might think of in, pandemic and public health security or environmental security. Look at something like NotPetya and its spread pattern, right? It's unpredictable. It spread within a targeted territory, but then very quickly, but in kind of an uneven fashion out with that territory across the global stage. There are parallels to nuclear security accidents as well, Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and so on. There are things that the international community, even the Chinese, even the Russians, even the Iranians, could agree that, well, this is a deviancy, right? This is these specific categories of potential effects are negative. They have a negative impact, largely because they introduce a lot of uncertainty to foreign policy making in the conduct of international affairs. And, these are areas wherein, again, bit by bit, chip by chip, I do think international cooperation could start to pare down I'm going to use the term, right, acceptable parameters of agreed competition in cyberspace between competitors. And so, again, I don't want to appear to be the doomsayer in the room by simply saying, how do you verify? It's never going to work. I don't believe that. I just think I think some new conceptualization is required to move the ticker forward.
So
Yeah, I completely
let
agree
me
with this.
build on this. Joe, do you both think that moving towards Budapest type agreements to focus on creating standards within countries to enforce laws and things would carry over towards international behaviors?
I'd say I wouldn't apply this to everywhere, but at least that seems to be the approach that certain groups are making. So ASEAN, for instance, that's the approach that they're making, both within their larger cybersecurity initiative and their more targeted focus, the more targeted cybersecurity working group amongst defense ministers. So, but again, this focusing on the standards, you'd still also have to overcome additional issues like capacity, for instance. So this is this is one of the main criticisms I level against the whole ASEAN approach here, that yes, this could probably work for the original founding members who at least have the base level of competency and capability to establish these standards. But if you look at the relatively new members of the organization, they might not be at that same level. So how do you overcome that? So that's one way to approach it, but it's not free from issues of its own.
Okay. Well, I think we're at time. So, but I just wanted to say this has been great, and I really appreciate you taking the time to spend your, I guess it's evening in Zurich, so evening in Zurich with us. And I look forward to a day when the pandemic's over and we can come back and have beers and down in downtown Zurich again. So thank you very much.
You're always welcome to come.
And if everybody would just give a round of applause for Miguel.
Thank you for inviting me.
And so thank you very much. So I'm going to stop the recording and I'm going to leave it go.